The Porsche arrived on a Thursday. It came on the back of a flatbed truck, wrapped in a car cover that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and it was delivered not to a dealership, not to a certified repair center, but to Merritt Hollow, a town of 4,000 people halfway between Kamloops and nowhere, where the Tim Hortons closed at 9, and the gas station was also the post office. Fletcher Holt watched the truck back into the lot from the window of his garage. He had a mug of coffee going cold in his left hand, and a timing belt draped over his right shoulder, and he did not move for a long moment. He just watched. The driver climbed down from the cab and looked around at the gravel lot, at the hand-painted sign above the bay doors that read Holt Automotive, at the rusted wind chime that Fletcher's daughter Penny had made in grade 3, and that he had never taken down. The driver looked like a man who had expected something different. Fletcher set his coffee on the workbench and went outside. The Porsche was a Taycan Turbo S Midnight Blue, the kind of car that arrived at garages the way a surgeon might arrive at a walk-in clinic. Technically there, but clearly somewhere it had never intended to be. The flatbed driver handed Fletcher a clipboard and an envelope without making eye contact. Inside the envelope was a note, handwritten on paper so thick it had a sound when you unfolded it. Mr. Holt, your name was recommended. The car has been seen by 3 different service centers, including 2 Porsche-certified dealerships. No one has been able to identify the fault. I will arrive Friday afternoon. S. Callaway. Fletcher read it twice. He looked at the car. He looked at the note again. He didn't recognize the name. He handed the clipboard back and asked the driver if he knew anything else. The driver shrugged. Just that she wanted it here, and not somewhere with a waiting room that has a cappuccino machine. Fletcher almost smiled. He pulled off the car cover alone, folded it carefully, and set it on the shelf above the tool cabinet. Then he stood back and looked at the Taycan the way he had learned to look at things, the way his father had taught him, and the way 7 years at Magna International had reinforced. Not at what was wrong, but at what the car was trying to tell him. It didn't tell him anything yet. It just sat there looking expensive and broken and a little embarrassed about both. He ran his own diagnostics that evening after his daughter Juniper had been picked up by the neighbor for hockey practice. The garage was quiet. The overhead fluorescents hummed. Fletcher connected his scan tool, not the consumer-grade stuff, but a PIWIS-compatible unit he'd sourced 2 years ago from a retiring dealership tech, and let it talk to the car. The codes were a mess. 7 active faults, 4 pending, and 2 that contradicted each other in ways that didn't make physical sense unless you understood that they weren't the problem. They were what the problem caused. There's a difference, and most technicians, good ones, even, treat the codes like a diagnosis instead of a symptom. Fletcher wrote everything down in a small notebook. He had terrible handwriting. His wife used to tell him his prescriptions were going to get someone killed, which didn't make sense because he wasn't a doctor. But he'd understood what she meant. She'd had a way of being funny that didn't announce itself. He closed the notebook and turned off the scan tool and sat on his stool for a while in the quiet. He missed her more. At night, he had made a kind of peace with the daytime. The work, the routines, Juniper's school lunches and hockey schedule, and the way she needed him present and deliberate. The nights were still hers. He hadn't fully figured out what to do about that. He turned off the lights and locked up and went home. Sloane Callaway arrived Friday at 2:15. Fletcher had seen the name on the business section of the Vancouver Sun once, maybe 18 months ago. Callaway Developments, the kind of company that bought waterfront property and turned it into something that required a lifestyle to afford. He hadn't connected the name to the note until he looked her up Thursday night, and then he'd sat with his laptop for a moment longer than necessary, recalibrating. She drove herself from the highway in a rental, a Ford Escape that looked like she'd never driven anything so practical in her life, and parked it at a slight angle to the lot like the geometry of Merritt Hollow confused her. She was somewhere in her mid-40s, dressed in the way that very composed people dress when they're trying to look casual and don't entirely pull it off. Dark wool coat, good boots. She carried herself like someone who was accustomed to being the most prepared person in any room and found it faintly exhausting. Fletcher was under the Taycan when she arrived. He heard her footsteps on the gravel, deliberate, unhurried, and he finished what he was doing before he rolled out. "Mr. Holt," she said. "Monsieur Callaway." He stood, wiped his hands. He didn't offer to shake. They were still damp from the solvent, and she didn't seem to expect it. She looked at the car, then at him. He could see her doing the assessment that people like her always did, and he was used to it, and it didn't bother him the way it once had. "Can I ask," she said, "what you think is wrong with it? I have some ideas." The Porsche dealership in Kelowna had ideas for 11 days, she said. They replaced the high-voltage charging module, the battery management controller, and both front inverters. She said it the way someone recites numbers when the numbers have become a kind of grief. $430,000. Fletcher looked at the car. "Did that fix it?" he asked, though he already suspected the answer. "It started 3 times after that," she said. "Then it stopped again, permanently." He nodded slowly. "Who recommended me?" There was a brief pause, the kind that means someone is deciding how much of the truth to give. "A man named Kowalski. He was a tech at the GM plant in Oshawa before it closed. He said you were the only person he knew who actually understood how these systems fail, rather than what they fail into." Fletcher hadn't spoken to Kowalski in 2 years. He made a note to call him. "I'd like to look at it properly," Fletcher said. "Give me the weekend." Sloane Calloway looked at him for a moment. Something in her expression shifted, not softened exactly, but adjusted. The way a person adjusts when they've been holding themselves very still for a long time and they've decided, against their better judgment, to stop. "All right," she said. She came back Saturday morning without calling ahead. Fletcher was in the bay with the Taycan's rear quarter panel off and his head inside the wheel arch when he heard the gravel again. He finished his measurement before acknowledging her presence. She was standing just outside the open bay door with 2 cups of coffee from the gas station down the road, which told him she'd been here before or done her research, because there was nowhere else in Merritt Hollow to get coffee at 8 in the morning. She held one out. He took it. "You don't have to be here," he said. It wasn't rude. It was just accurate. "I know," she said. "I don't have anywhere else to be until Monday." That surprised him. He looked at her sideways. "The car is not the only thing that needed to stop," she said, and then seemed to surprise herself with the honesty of it, and looked away at the hills behind the lot. Fletcher drank his coffee. It was terrible. The gas station had not improved since Angie had been alive to complain about it. "My wife used to say this coffee tasted like a committee decision," he said, mostly to himself. Sloane made a small sound that might have been a laugh. "Used to? She died 4 years ago," he said, not dramatically, just as information. "I'm sorry," she said. And she meant it. He could tell the difference by now between the people who meant it and the people for whom it was a conversational formality. "So was I," he said. "Still am some days." He went back to work. She stayed. She didn't talk much, which he appreciated. She watched him work the way people watch skilled hands when they realize they're seeing something they can't quite name. Not the task, but the relationship between a person and a task they understand completely. Around 11, Juniper showed up on her bike. She was 9. She had her mother's stubbornness and Fletcher's habit of walking into a room and immediately identifying what was broken. She dropped her bike against the fence post, came into the bay, looked at the Porsche, looked at Sloane, and said, "Are you the one who owns the blue car?" "I am," said Sloane. "Dad says it's been misdiagnosed," said Juniper, with the confidence of a child who has grown up hearing precise language used about imprecise problems. Sloane looked at Fletcher. He shrugged slightly. "He might be right," said Sloane. Juniper considered this. "He usually is," she said, and went to find her book. Sloane watched her go. Something moved across her face. Something careful and private. And then she looked back at the car. "You're raising her alone," she said. "Not a question." "She's raising herself," Fletcher said. "I'm just providing the infrastructure." The Porsche had a thermal contraction fault in the high-voltage cable harness, specifically in the section that ran along the driver's side sill beneath the floor panel. The insulation had developed a microfracture, invisible to standard inspection, that had been caused by a combination of factory tolerance at the edge of spec and the kind of sustained cold that British Columbia winters applied with patience and without mercy. When the ambient temperature dropped below 7 degrees, the cable contracted fractionally. The fracture closed. The resistance spiked. The power management system saw an anomaly it couldn't categorize, threw codes in 3 different subsystems simultaneously to cover its uncertainty, and shut the car down to protect itself. When the car warmed up, in a heated dealership bay, in a diagnostic center, anywhere indoors, the fracture opened. The resistance normalized. The codes disappeared. The technicians found nothing because by the time they looked, there was nothing to find. It was the kind of fault that required you to understand the car's logic before you could see past it. Not what the system reported, why it reported it, what it was afraid of. Fletcher had suspected it by Friday night. He confirmed it Saturday afternoon with a resistance trace run at ambient temperature in the unheated bay, with the roll-up door open and the thermometer reading 4 degrees. He called Sloan into the bay. He showed her the readings on the screen. He explained, without condescension, what he was looking at and why it mattered. She asked 3 questions. Good ones. Precise, technical, showing that she had done serious research in the weeks since the dealerships had failed her. He answered each one. How long to fix it, she asked. 2 hours, he said. Maybe 3. She was very still. The dealership in Kelowna had the car for 11 days, she said. They were looking for what the car told them was wrong. Fletcher said, I was looking for what it was hiding. He completed the repair Sunday morning. New harness section, correctly routed, with an additional thermal sleeve on the sill run that should have been standard from the factory and wasn't. He ran a full systems check at cold temperature. Everything clean. He started the car. The Taycan's motor made a sound like silence, organized. He let it run for 20 minutes. Then he shut it off and started it again. 3 times. 4. He was methodical about it, the way he was methodical about everything that mattered. Sloan was standing in the doorway of the bay when he finished. She had driven into Kamloops the night before and come back this morning with proper coffee, not from the gas station, and she had brought one for him and one for herself and had set his on the workbench without interrupting. He rolled out from under the car and stood. It's done, he said. She walked to the car. She looked at it for a long moment, the way you look at something you've been afraid for. Then she opened the door and sat in the driver's seat and put her hands on the wheel, and Fletcher turned away to give her the moment, because he understood that some things between a person and a machine are private. When she got out, her face was composed again, but her eyes were slightly bright, not crying, close to it but held. What do I owe you? She asked. He handed her the invoice. He had charged his standard rate, the same rate he charged the retired teachers and the mothers and the mill workers and the single mothers and the farmers who drove 40 minutes into Merritt Hollow, because his rates were fair and his work was honest. It was not a number that reflected what he'd done or what the others had failed to do. It was the number it was. She looked at it. Something crossed her face that he couldn't entirely read. Mr. Holt, she said. Fletcher, he said. It was the first time he'd offered it. This is not enough, she said. It's what it costs, he said. What you found, what you fixed, that's not something that gets invoiced at a garage rate. This is a garage, he said without apology. She looked at him. He looked at her. The wind moved through the open bay door, and the rusted wind chime made its small sound, and neither of them spoke for a moment. The 3 dealerships cost me $430,000, she said quietly, and the car still didn't start. I know, he said. You charged me $1,200. That's what it took to fix it, he said. That's what I charge. She wrote the check. She wrote it for more than the invoice. And he knew before he looked that he wouldn't win an argument about it. And he was tired, and the coffee was good, and Juniper would be back from her grandmother's at 4. He accepted it. She sat in his small waiting area, 2 mismatched chairs, a side table with a plant that Juniper watered every Friday, and she called her assistant and rearranged her Monday morning, and Fletcher made another pot of coffee and brought her a cup because it seemed like the thing to do. The Kowalski who sent you here, Fletcher said. Did he tell you anything else about me? He said you left a very good job, she said. A chief engineer position at a Tier 1 supplier. That you came back here after your wife died, and you opened a garage and you never explained why. Fletcher looked at his coffee. There's a theory, she said carefully, that says grief should move us toward larger things, away from the pain. More ambition, more distraction, more achievement. That's one theory, he said. I subscribed to it, she said. For about 3 years after my marriage ended, I built 3 new developments, hired 40 people, won an industry award. She paused. I was extraordinarily productive and completely hollow. Fletcher said nothing. He understood the architecture of what she was describing. I came here because of a car, she said. But I think I also came because Kowalski told me about a man who walked away from everything sensible and chose something real. And I wanted to see what that looked like. He looked at her. She looked at the window, at the gravel lot, at the hills going pale gold in the afternoon. "It looks like this," he said. She turned to him, and for the first time since she'd driven the rental into his lot at a crooked angle on Friday afternoon, Sloane Calloway smiled. Not the managed, careful expression she'd been carrying like a piece of professional equipment. Something real. Something that reached her eyes and stayed there. "Yes," she said, "I can see that." She drove the Taycan back to Vancouver on Monday morning. She sent a message through his business contact form 2 days later, not personal, not overreaching. Just a note that said the car had started without fault in temperatures of 2 degrees and -4, and that she had never once been more grateful for the honesty of a mechanic. He read it on his phone in the bay. Standing next to the '09 F-150, he was rebuilding for the Granger family up near the lake. Juniper was in the waiting area doing homework. He could hear her erasing something and muttering about fractions. He set his phone down. He picked up his wrench. The truck needed a new timing chain tensioner, and the weather was turning cold again, and there was work to do. Real work. The kind that asked something of you and gave something back. That was enough. Most days, it was more than enough. And on the days when it wasn't, when the nights were long and the wind chime was too loud in the quiet, he allowed himself those too. That was what being alive looked like in Merritt Hollow, in a small garage at the edge of a gravel lot, where the sign was hand-painted and the coffee came from a gas station, and the man inside understood machines the way he had learned to understand grief. Not by fixing what they told you was broken, but by listening for what they were trying not to say.